the general topic of this conference, as you know, is Europe, Old Continent, and the New World. This is a subject upon which I've written several books over the past 40 years or so, probably too many. The most recent in 2003 was called Rethinking Europe's Future. And I'm now finishing a new one, probably to be called Unipolar Folly, which you'll hear a bit of tonight. As you might imagine, this is not exclusively about Europe, this book. To be upfront about my message, Europe and the United States don't imagine the future in the same way. Our political imaginations are tuned to different geopolitical wavelengths. Hence my talk, The European Union and the US Dissonant Visions for the New World Order. Now, speculating about the New World Order has been in vogue since the collapse of the Soviet Union at the start of the 1990s. And we Americans have all along been much inclined to see this new global order as unipolar, with ourselves cast in the role of the world's unique superpower, the world's natural and benign hegemon, boss. We are, to be sure, the most single powerful country in the world. But by now, I suspect, we understand better what we should have realized earlier. That is to say, global power will almost inevitably grow more dispersed as the new century progresses. The global system will be not hegemonic, but plural, multipolar. Now, what does this prognosis suggest about world order and peace in the future? The answer you choose depends ultimately upon what theories of international relations you favor. And let me point out three: the realist, the liberal, and the constitutionalist, and try to spell out the radically different implications of these distinct theories of international relations. This process will elucidate, I hope, why worldviews are so dissonant across the Atlantic and what difference that makes. I mean, to start with the realist school, realists like to assert their kinship with Thomas Hobbes, the great English philosopher of the early 17th century, which was, of course, a terrible moment in English history, a time of violent revolution, pitiless religious warfare. And doubtless, there are more than a few of you here because your ancestors fled England in that era of great troubles. And not surprisingly, Hobbes, living in this world, thought a war of all against all, of everyone against everyone else, was the natural state of human society. To avoid it, he taught, create an absolute sovereign who can simply overawe the rest of the society and that way maintain peace. And by the same logic applied to international relations, to avoid endless warfare among states, again, the natural condition of states among themselves, choose a hegemon, a dominant state, to impose order on the rest. Now, classical liberals, as we know, had and still have a radically different view. Their teacher is, I suppose we could say, Hobbes's great rival, the philosopher John Locke, who pointed the way to a second great liberal teacher, the political economist Adam Smith. Smith's great work, The Wealth of Nations, was published, you may remember, in the same year as Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Liberals believe that states and state systems are naturally harmonious. once evildoers, bad guys, tyrants, or monopolists are purged, then democracy plus the free market will generate an optimal civil order. And while followers of Hobbes emphasize the military competition of states, which is almost by its nature a zero-sum game, classical liberals vaunt international free trade, competition, as Adam Smith taught, with abundant mutual benefits. Here again, freedom, the free market, guarantees harmonious success. Liberals get a further bonus from Immanuel Kant, no less, who argues that states, once they are democratic, no longer war with one another. Instead, they delight in perpetual peace. Liberals, in short, are industrious at home and peaceful abroad. Now, these two visions, the Hobbesian and liberal, are still very much around, although they often get mixed up, particularly in present-day America. Here, many analysts embrace a hybrid combination that allows them to be simultaneously to follow Locke, Smith, and Kant on the one hand, and Hobbes on the other. Domestically, they are liberals. Democracy, they believe, can be counted on to produce the optimal forms of national economics and politics. But to have peace in the international system requires something additional: a dominant state, a liberal hegemon endowed with Hobbesian supremacy, Hobbesian power. And America's hybrid liberals are partial to a particular view of modern history, one that invokes the great liberal peace of the 19th century, the Pax Britannica, and notes how quickly it vanished, that peace, once Britain grew too weak to overcome its rivals, Germany, and in a sense also the United States. 2 world wars were the consequence of this British weakness, and the liberal world order could not be rebuilt securely until after World War II, when a Pax Americana took over Britain's former role. Decades later, China's conversion and the Soviet Union's collapse have extended that Pax Americana so that now we can see the whole world drawn into a reborn liberal global system. Nevertheless, as the tragedy of 9/11 illustrates, our global Pax Americana has many enemies and will last only so long as there is American power to back it up. Now, analysts who are caught in this view of history, along with the politicians who reflect this view, end up favoring a sort of imperial peace theory. To work, Adam Smith's liberal vision requires not only the invisible hand of the free market, but also the visible hand of a hegemon. Similarly, before it can work, Kant's Prussian peace theory, he was a Prussian after all, needs to be armed with American shock and awe. In effect, there exists in our American political imagination a caesura between prevailing theories of the domestic state, which is meant to be free, democratic, and constitutional, and prevailing theories of the international state system, which is meant to be hegemonic. Now, intellectually, or at least tactically, there are advantages to this mix, particularly, it seems to me, for American liberals, who are always worried about being considered soft about power. This Hobbesian dimension to American liberalism helps explain why the Democrats have for so long been such feeble critics of the Bush administration's foreign policy. Many, as we know, have for a long time been as fierce in defending the vision of American global hegemony as the administration's Republicans. But of course, just because we Americans all agree that our global hegemony is the best way to organize the world, doesn't mean that the rest of the world accepts our conclusion. Indeed, even among our closest allies in Europe, there has never been any shortage of critics of our fondness for hegemony. And recent history certainly suggests that our pursuit of international hegemony has grown not only unpopular, but self-defeating. Asserting unilateral military power has now embroiled us in conflicts where we seem unlikely to prevail and have great difficulty extricating ourselves. It has created enemies even among old friends. It has provoked asymmetrical forms of warfare that we cannot reliably defend ourselves against, despite what we think of as our peerless military strength. And recent history also discourages expectations of a unipolar world economy, which continues to feed us with unlimited resources, many of which are increasingly paid for by others. Well, if American hegemony is in fact no longer sustainable, then our unipolar vision is increasingly dysfunctional. In effect, Hobbes's realism, his hegemonic prescription for world order, is an unrealistic guide for American policy in the 21st century. To be sure, Kant's liberal vision of automatic peace among democracies is even more inappropriate. For surely the Hobbesians have one thing right. In an increasingly plural world, a world of several great powers, some rising rapidly, others trying to hang on, does provide abundant prospects for conflict. And particularly since military trends suggest a continuing surfeit and greater proliferation of nuclear weapons. Well, if a plural world can neither anticipate Kant's democratic harmony nor achieve Hobbes's hegemonic remedy, we perhaps had better look for some different theories of international relations, a more realistic model for world order, one that neither presumes liberal harmony nor requires Hobbesian hegemony. Instead, we need a theory that provides a framework for balancing, where a plural world of several great powers, rising and falling, can learn to conciliate each other's reasonable dreams. This requires international machinery to anticipate and resolve problems before they grow unmanageable. In effect, this gets us to a third theory of international relations, what I labeled a few minutes ago constitutionalism. Like the Hobbesian approach, the constitutionalist approach sees conflict within and among states as natural, but its corrective prescriptions are very different. At the base of any constitutionalist model of government is the ancient, and in our country recently, the much abused idea of the balance of power. In this constitutional model, it envisions an interdependent system, states that have a great deal to do with each other, that remains plural, with a variety of strong-willed states who, even if they have spent much of their history warring with each other, still have abundant conflicts of interest, nevertheless have learned to coexist peacefully, cooperatively, and successfully. If we had to find an example of such a model in the real world, it would in fact be hard to avoid choosing the European Union. Now, of course, constitutionalism is a very old tradition among ourselves, as well as the Europeans. But unlike our own great continental experiment, Europe's union does not have a Hobbesian or a federal sovereign at its center. The EU is not a federation, in the American sense. Very likely it is not even an American-style federation in the making. Rather, it remains an association of free and very distinctive nation-states. Far from aiming to abandon their real sovereign power, they are in the Union to increase it. By cooperating in an organized constitutional fashion, member states can achieve national aims that they could never hope to achieve alone. And this confederal reality makes the European Union much more complex and interesting than the usual theories that attempt to explain it. For such a vision to succeed, this kind of union, its regional identity and values must become a vital part of the national identity and sovereignty of the member states themselves. By internalizing in each member state a regional identity, the EU provides each national constitution with a sort of institutionalized superego to broaden and discipline national policy. As inserting a regional identity within the national identity makes it possible to transform interstate relations from a zero-sum game to one of mutual gain. Unlike in Adam Smith's vision of the liberal market, however, finding this harmony is not expected to be an automatic process where each member pursues its own interest and nature somehow provides for the whole. Instead, success in this kind of union requires perpetual study and negotiation to identify and to achieve common interests and values. The union provides the machinery for that study and negotiation, and I suppose above all it provides the mindset that favors it. With this union, Europe has in effect created a new political formula. If we are optimistic, we might say that Europe, which invented the nation-state after all, has now been incubating the formula to complete the nation-state, to extend the nation-state model into a cooperative regional model. Can that model somehow replace American hegemony as a more viable formula for bringing peace to a plural world? The idea is intriguing, but not altogether convincing. I mean, to begin with, Europe's achievement, of course, is the result of an extremely painful learning process. Can the rest of the world appropriate Europe's accomplishment without first passing through its suffering? Well, in today's world, there is certainly no lack of suffering, but perhaps it is not so efficaciously distributed as it was among the European states in World War II. All European states understood that they must never go to war again, and all suffered terribly as a result of their past experiences. Beyond that, Europe's post-war successes owed a great deal to some very special further conditions. There was a period of unprecedented growth in the mid-20th century, leading to a remarkable level of prosperity. Or the Cold War itself, with the Americans playing the role of generous protector against both the Soviets or against any return to aggression among Europe's own major states. And the Soviets too played a role, keeping the US in Europe closely attentive and often deferential to Europe's shifting political winds. And finally, within Europe itself, the special partnership that has evolved between France and Germany, that partnership which is the real foundation in many ways of this European Union. None of these conditions is easily duplicated in other and quite different parts of the world. And in any event, the European Union is a living organism. And like most living organisms, it faces a variety of life-threatening ailments. It now faces two particularly dangerous internal challenges. The first is organizational and constitutional. How to embrace so many and diverse new members without losing coherence and direction. Enlargement has complicated consensus building at the very moment when the Union also urgently needs to expand its scope and into spheres that often require rapid and resolute decision-making. Europe requires, for example, the military capacity to keep order in its own enlarged surroundings, as Yugoslavia, after all, made painfully clear a decade ago. And while Europe needs to hang on to its American alliance, it can no longer simply follow our lead. Europe needs to recast its own relations with Russia and with the Arab world. Its interests in both places are ultimately even greater than America's, and with the best will in the world, not necessarily identical. Nor do the EU's global interests allow it to be a negligible force in Africa, Asia, or Latin America. Well, European armed forces are already, in fact, embroiled around the world. Trying to conduct a more forceful and independent diplomacy, however, puts great strains on Europe's own inner cohesion. Old differences among British, French, Germans, and Italians recur as the new fault lines of European unity. And the new member states issuing from the communist bloc often have dissonant perspectives on the nature and future of the Union. So achieving the necessary consensus promises at best to take time that is increasingly short. And in these circumstances, our own tendency, America's tendency toward jealous subversion of the Union, which has been all too obvious in the last few years, is particularly damaging. Europe faces a second major historic challenge: how to preserve the humane values of its welfare states in today's radically more competitive global markets. The conventional, logical solution is to upgrade Europe's technology and education to keep its labor competitive despite the high wage costs. This is the thrust of the EU's so-called Lisbon goals. The goals, of course, are admirable and necessary, but they're also insufficient. Given the huge size and potential quality of the Chinese and Indian labor forces and their extremely low wages, any successful European adaptation to globalism will necessarily involve some political regulation of trade. But for Europe to meet this challenge, not only trying to protect its own social peace and environment, but also reconciling its own needs with the ambitions of a rapidly rising Asia. China, too, claims the right to grow and flourish, and it will certainly assert that right energetically in this new century. It forms a vast and rapidly expanding market, and Europe cannot afford to cut itself off from it. In a sense, today's explosive rise of China, not to mention India, does have disturbing similarities to the rapid growth of Germany, Japan, and the United States in the years leading to World War I. In the last century, everyone paid a terrible price for failing to create a global system that could reconcile old and new powers. China's huge scale, not to mention India's, makes those problems of the 20th century seem comparatively trivial. And our problems today, moreover, are now hugely complicated by an impending ecological crisis. Among other things, it will not be easy to resolve the Chinese problem simply by more growth. The need to avoid repeating the disastrous failures of the 20th century is what makes Europe's post-war experience so important for the world. Our new century urgently needs Europe's gift for building institutions that can appease rival interests and transform conflict into cooperation. Now again, Europe's model offers no magic liberal formula. Its method is the pragmatic realism of the constitutionalist worldview in general. Expect conflict, but work to overcome it. Success requires continuous hard bargaining with results that reinforce the union. It requires enlightened political leadership, gifted technocracy, a dense network of informal links and interests connecting technocrats, politicians across the continent, in Europe's case, or across the world. But this EU, as it exists, for all its problems, it does exist. And we should occasionally recognize it for what it is, the most advanced political achievement of our time, a rich source of inspiration for the problems that are fast coming upon all of us. If there is a model that can save our century, it is likely to be Europe's model, perpetual engagement and bargaining dedicated to what we might call reciprocal appeasement. It is unlikely to be the Hobbesian model of global American hegemony, either in its pure imperial form or in its hybrid liberal variation. But of course, this European model is unlikely to succeed if we ourselves oppose it. Let me finish by discussing relations between the EU and the US. Only a few years ago, European reactions to America's invasion of Iraq put the world into, I guess we could describe it as a state of geopolitical flux. In effect, 3 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, France, Russia, and China, plus Germany, denied legitimacy to our unipolar status as the world's hegemon, and instead asserted a different vision of global governance, plural and constitutional. The drama in the UN Security Council allowed the glimpse of a new configuration of global power. Public opinion around the world seemed strongly appreciative. Nevertheless, the US and Britain, supported by Japan, went ahead, at first, as we know, with brilliant military success. They were also able to punish France and Germany by demonstrating the EU's own disunity. Subsequent events, as we all know, have sobered both sides. America's military and diplomatic position has deteriorated to the point where it threatens broad Western interests throughout the world. Limiting the damage has provided the US and old Europe with a new common interest. With the US weakened and unreliable, European states, including the increasingly disillusioned British, have been fitfully mending their own unity. Europe finally shows signs of exercising some effective military power of its own. More significantly, in the present time, European diplomacy, again drawing support from Russia and China, has asserted itself with unaccustomed force, maneuvering the US into new positions over Iran, Lebanon, and Palestine. Of course, Europe's initiatives may stall or fail. Nevertheless, the reality of a multipolar world seems to be imposing itself. The unipolar vision of the 1990s seems harder and harder to sustain. We can only hope that the West can adapt, avoiding a catastrophic breakdown of relations, for a start, across the Atlantic. Unfortunately, at this moment, this moment of historic challenge, both the US and Europe are suffering from frozen historical imaginations. Imaginations fixated on past accomplishments rather than present challenges. For both Western Europe and the United States, the post-war era was an unprecedented success, but in opposite ways. Europe's great powers turned inward, away from their empires and from the near suicidal competition for global power, which had nearly destroyed them all. Together, they tamed their inner devils. They built a regional union, something we, of course, had achieved here a century and a half earlier. Post-war America, by contrast, turned outward, among other things, to protect Europe and Japan from the great external evils that threatened them. Neither the US nor Europe could have succeeded without the assistance of the other. Europe's great experiment with internal healing needed America's protecting presence, which gave the wounded West European states the courage to cooperate. At the same time, Europe's support reinforced and legitimized America's world leadership. With Europe's collaboration, the US could fulfill its Wilsonian dream of leading the world, but by invitation. For both Europe and America, however, too much success in the 20th century has become a danger for the 21st. Both of us have grown trapped in dysfunctional nostalgia. Both now have a great transformation to make. The United States must learn to lead in a plural world. For that, it must exorcise the demon of unipolarity, grow less assertive, more self-confident, perhaps. Europe, on the other hand, must consolidate and focus its resources and accept the responsibility of having them. In short, Europe needs to grow more forceful for its own sake. It is, for example, in Europe's vital interest to avoid a war of civilizations with the Arab and broader Muslim world. It is essential for Europe that there be, and soon, a durable and equitable settlement between Israel and Palestine. And Europe must find the political and institutional imagination needed to embrace a resurgent Russia and a rising China and India. If Europe fails to meet these challenges, America will also suffer, not only around the world, but above all, at home. We Americans should recognize that we have a dangerous concentration of power in Washington, dangerous for the world and for ourselves. Like all great powers, the US needs to be checked and balanced. For superpowers like ourselves, something beyond a purely national constitutional framework is required. To keep power in check at home, it must also be balanced abroad. Europe's states paid a terrible price to learn this lesson among themselves in 2 world wars. Europe's post-war evolution suggests a larger historical lesson. Among states, as among individuals, balancing is often better done among friends than between enemies, in a cooperative rather than a zero-sum relationship. Today, the Iraq misadventure has shown clearly how much America needs to be contained by its friends, by those who share the values of liberty at home and respect for the rights of other peoples. Again, there is too much power in Washington for our national constitution to handle by itself. To be Europe's stabilizing friend, was America's vital post-war role. Europe, in a sense, must now assume that role for the overstretched and disoriented constitution of post-Soviet America. Restoring balance to America requires restoring power to Europe. In 1826, a very great statesman of the time, the British Foreign Secretary George Canning, bragged to Parliament how he had called the New World into existence to redress the balance of the old. Perhaps the 21st century will prove the time when the old world returns the favor. But of course, we Americans have our own indispensable role to play. No one can save our Constitution if we are not determined to save ourselves. American conservatives, in particular, will need to rediscover their own traditional virtues, a constitutional respect for institutions and balance, for good manners within and among nations, together with a healthy reserve about the will to power, above all when clothed in self-serving ideals. In short, to adapt to the plural world rapidly coming upon us, each side of the West will need to find a new inner strength, balance, and wisdom, and a new world role. And to succeed, each side will need the other. Thank you.